Hi, everyone. We're just going to give folks a few minutes to enter the webinar, and then we'll get started shortly. Thanks. All right, I know people are still coming in, but we have a lot to cover in this hour, and we want to make sure that there is time for questions. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. This is being recorded, so if you are joining and hear us in the middle of things, just know that we will be sharing out the recording later. So thank you everyone for being on today. This is a briefing on emerging legislation impacting LGBTQ plus families and family building. For those of you who I don't know, I'm Amanda Johnston. I'm the Director of Public Affairs and Education at GLAAD. A couple of quick notes. We are recording, as I said, and we'll share the recording out with everybody who registered, as well as some additional information. We're going to try to leave about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So please use the Q&A box, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your screen, and you can just type in your questions. Go ahead and type them in when they occur to you. We'll keep track of them, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the Q&A session. And then importantly, I want to say now, and you'll probably hear this a couple of times, please feel free to reach out to any of our organizations and any of the folks on this briefing with additional questions, or if you are seeing any of this legislation in your states. And I'll post that information for everybody in the chat a couple of times today. So now I am very happy to introduce today's panelists. So with us we have Jordan Budd, if everybody want to just give a wave. Jordan Budd, who is the Executive Director at Collage. Polly Crozier, who is the Director of Family Advocacy at GLAAD, GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders. Julie Gonen, who is Federal Policy Director at NCLR. Nesta Johnson, who is Family Law Staff Attorney at NCLR. And Meg York, who's Director of LGBTQ plus Family Law and Policy and Senior Policy Counsel at Family Equality. So thank you all for being here. Now to get started, I'm going to hand this off to Jordan, who's going to give an overview on LGBTQ family building and some of the risks that we are starting to see emerge. Thanks, Jordan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amanda, for that lovely introduction. I'm excited to be here with all of you. Again, my name is Jordan Budd. I use he and him pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Collage. Collage is the only national organization that focuses on people with LGBTQ plus parents. So LGBTQ family legal issues are right up our alley. And what we're going to be largely talking about today is in the realm of donor conception and all of the ways in which that impacts LGBTQ plus families, and also some of the ways where we're having to play both offense and a little bit of defense when discussing these issues. As you can imagine, a great number of our community members are donor conceived, and we tend to have a very different experience with donor conception in the queer family circle than a lot of folks who are raised in heterosexual families happen to have. And so backing up a little bit, over the past 2 years, Collage and Family Equality, GLAAD and NCLR have all been working collaboratively to respond to a growing movement led by a group of adult donor-conceived people seeking legal remedies for industry practices that they feel have harmed them. It's really important to note that the majority of the folks who are leading this movement do come from heterosexual parented families that withheld information about their use of donor gametes. And that really is, in my opinion, the center of a lot of this controversy. So these conversations certainly didn't begin 2 years ago, but the introduction and subsequent passage of a bill in Colorado in 2021 that effectively bans unknown gamete provision for prospective parents in Colorado prompted an organized response from all of us. We now know that over 70% of prospective parents who are looking to use sperm donation to create their families are either LGBTQ couples or people or single mothers by choice. Egg donation is trending in the same direction, but is still primarily used by heterosexual couples. Later in this briefing, my colleagues will discuss the various types of legislation that could potentially impact our families, as well as the more explicit and implicit threats that come along with that legislation. But for now, I want to elaborate a little bit on the terminology that we're going to use, as well as some of the high-level concerns. So first, gametes are the scientific or technical term for human eggs and sperm. So if we're saying gametes, that's what we're talking about. And again, we are primarily talking about sperm and sperm donation. This does obviously impact egg donation, but the process of egg donation is a lot more complicated. There are not the possibility of what many in the community would call serial donors in terms of egg donation. And so again, just keep in mind that primarily we're talking about sperm donation, but egg donation is included. Also, gamete providers is the word that we use really in a political context for sperm and egg donors. So these are the individuals that are contributing genetic material to prospective parents, either through the use of a bank or clinic or directly through personal relationships or social networks. Another really important piece to note here is that a lot of gamete provision does happen outside of the quote unquote clinical context. And so there's a lot of folks who have known donors because they're using a member of their family or a close friend, et cetera. And that is really all happening outside of the realm of regulation. There are generally three kinds of gamete donation that's important to know. Unknown donation, in which parents and offspring are not guaranteed any identifying information about the gamete provider ever. As you might imagine, 23andMe and other genetic testing services have really complicated the ability for anyone to remain unknown, but that is still an option for some people in most states. Open ID donation, in which offspring are allowed to request identifying information of the gamete provider when they turn 18, is probably the largest growing area of donation. And something that I believe all of our organizations would suggest to folks in terms of, what option to pursue in the event that you're going through a bank or clinic. And then finally, known donor donation, where the identity of the donor is known to all parties and usually implies some kind of relationship or connection between the donor, the gamete provider, and the offspring, the parents, et cetera. Again, a close family member, a friend, et cetera. Also important to know are DCP, that just means donor conceived people. Apologies in advance if we slip into some nomenclature. We have really been deep in the weeds on these issues, and there are a whole host of terms that we're not going to go over right now. But DCP is probably the most important one. And again, that's donor conceived person or people. And then just to clarify, intended parents are the individuals who intend to raise a child, regardless of their biological connection or lack thereof to that child. So sometimes we might say prospective. So, people who are essentially consumers and looking for gametes, but intended parents are the legal category that we are most often referring to. And in most LGBTQ plus families, there's always at least one intended parent that is non-biologically connected to the child. So in terms of explicit and unintended threats to LGBTQ families, again, my colleagues are going to go into some specific examples of concerns that we have. But generally speaking, we are really alarmed at any attempt right now to legislate away a reproductive choice, especially in the post-Dobbs era. Much of like concerns about bans on IVF getting caught up in abortion bans across the country, the potential for far-right elements to seize on gaps in our legal infrastructure and do real harm to LGBTQ plus families and especially parents, more than they already are, is very high. I do also want to point out that there is a lot of common ground. I think in many ways, what we are arguing over is the ways in which our legal system is not protecting LGBTQ plus parents and families, and it already should be. But because those gaps exist, we are hesitant for some of the remedies that are being suggested by a lot of the groups that are leading this movement of adult donor conceived people. However, the common ground, in my personal opinion, far outweighs any discord that we have. First and foremost, that openness and transparency is essential for the healthy development of donor conceived people, and that access to important pieces of medical information should be the norm. I think we're all also in broad agreement that parentage reform for LGBTQ plus families is essential to safeguard the future of family formation for queer people. I do also just want to flag that there is an element of the movement that we're dealing with that is seemingly ready to align with more far-right elements, and that certainly do look to end all kinds of assisted reproduction as somehow unnatural or ungodly or whatever the verbiage they would like to use is. But that said, I do believe that we have much more in common than we do not in common. And again, to highlight, the majority of the collage community at this point is donor conceived. And so it's a bit like talking about conflicts between the Black community and the queer community, people like me who are both kind of end up falling to the wayside. And so it's really important to point out that this is not just one group versus another group, but in fact, there's a big meld. So that was a bit more than I was expecting, and I'm going to stop talking now and pass it over to Polly, who's going to get deeper into the recent, current, and likely bills.
Thank you so much, Jordan. And I just have to say thank you to Collage for doing the work of making sure the voices of children of LGBTQ families are really present in this discourse and part of the education, because those voices have not been heard, and they're incredibly important to this conversation. I'm going to be very brief and just give an overview of two of the areas of state laws that we're all kind of keeping an eye out for. And I think the key messages here, because we don't have a lot of time in this briefing, but we're always happy to connect offline, is that for people working in the states, please be on the lookout for these kinds of bills. And when you see them, be aware, be a little cautious, because these bills have unintended consequences for LGBTQ families and family building through assisted reproduction and reproductive justice in general. So we're here to provide support and see what we can do together to either improve bills, stop bills, or do the work that we can together in partnership. So one category of bills are called fertility fraud bills. These are bills that started out pretty simple and straightforward to address the unusual but high profile situation where a fertility doctor back in like the 1980s used his own sperm rather than donor sperm to inseminate a patient without their knowledge or consent. Right? Like if some folks might have seen the Netflix show Our Father, which is a dramatized example of that, clearly disturbing and wrongful behavior on behalf of individual doctors. But in the discourse today, these single stories of really harmful cases have taken on, a kind of out of scope life. Fertility healthcare has shifted so much in recent decades, and these kinds of actions don't really happen very much anymore. And the legislative efforts, which really started pretty narrow, like a law in Utah that really just criminalized doctors who use their own sperm without consent, have become much broader as they've moved through the states. And there are now 13 states that have enacted fertility fraud laws. and these laws are pending in a number of other states. For example, in New York State right now, right? And these broader fertility fraud bills essentially seek to really kind of broadly criminalize reproductive health care doctors, with very long prison sentences, and to criminalize doctors in situations where mistakes are made, right? And kind of assume that reproductive healthcare doctors are able to provide kind of every scrap of information about a gamete donor, their social history, their educational history, their criminal history, in a way that is just not how family building works. So I think that, there's a group called Right to Know, which is an extremist group that is really pushing for broad fertility fraud provisions to be passed in all the states. And I think that we would suggest really trying to hit pause on those and try to get some more information about what is the issue that they're trying to resolve, and making sure that they're not so broad as to really undermine the practice of reproductive medicine and undermine access to reproductive health care for families in that state. The second area that we're seeing more bills is regulating gametes themselves. So gamete regulation bills aim to say, how are people going to use sperm and egg in assisted reproduction? As Jordan mentioned, there's a number of new groups on the horizon of late discovery DCP advocates who are asking states to put in a number of limits, i.e., like the Colorado law, which was passed in right before Dobbs came down in 2022. And we would say, I'll briefly describe the main points. The Colorado law is not a model. We're hoping that it's one and done. It essentially imposes family limits on the number of families that can be created through gamete donation. It has an extraterritorial effect. So it says Colorado residents cannot use unknown donor gametes no matter where they are. And it requires specific kinds of education for intended parents and donors. And it does require, it's the only state in the country to require identity release of all donors at when the child hits age 18. Now, in any event, some aspects of the Colorado law, again, as Jordan said, are not necessarily not bad, right? I think there's the really kind of agreement that parents should be transparent with their children about their origins. Children should be able to know the identity and medical information about their gamete donor. It's the issue of enshrining it in law in a way that kind of has a potential to restrict autonomy in decision-making and have other unintended consequences. So as opposed to professional guidelines, industry regulations, and other strategies to achieve goals that are mutually beneficial for all. There is a model out there that some states are passing that's part of the Uniform Parentage Act of 2017. It's Article 9 that provides a model and has been used in 4 states. And what that model does is says parents and children should have access to non-identifying medical information at all times, and then sets forth a process for either learning of identity information of donors at age 18, if a donor permits that, or essentially having a process for allowing donors to make a decision that then is stored in records and is a child is either able to get the identity information at 18 or not, depending on that choice at the time of donation. So that is a very brief overview of kind of 2 areas of the law that we're just keeping a very close eye on, because again, these are actually in many cases being introduced in blue states. And so it does take some education to make sure people understand what these laws are about and how they interact with parentage laws and the security of families, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. And I'll pass it over to Julie.
Thanks, Polly. I will be super brief because I have the pleasure of being probably the least important speaker on this webinar, because I know this is largely focused on efforts at the state level, but we did want folks to be aware that these issues are also landing on the radar of some members of Congress, and there have been bills introduced at the federal level that we're watching. So the one I guess I would flag that we should take the most seriously is HR 451. It's the Protecting Families from Fertility Fraud Act. It's a lot of F's in there, of 2023. The reason why we're concerned about this is because it actually has a lot of the same elements that Polly was talking about in terms of these fertility fraud bills at the state level, but it is bipartisan. It has 44 co-sponsors at this point, and it's almost half and half Republicans and Democrats. And now I don't need to tell anybody here that Congress is a highly dysfunctional place. We averted a government shutdown this weekend by, I think, minutes. So it's unlikely that a bill like this is going to get all the way through the legislative process and land on President Biden's desk. But it's also really important that we watch these things, because sometimes bills do take a while before they eventually see the light of day, and we need to be vigilant at this early stage. This bill would criminalize anyone who knowingly misrepresents the nature or source of DNA used in assisted reproductive technology. So again, some of those concerns that Polly flagged for these state bills are very much present here. It's retroactive. And again, because it is bipartisan, that's why I fear that there's, some outside chance that it could move. So that's the one bill that's currently in the Congress right now that we're keeping an eye on. In the last Congress, the 117th, kind of like in the states, there were some federal bills introduced by well-meaning progressive lawmakers that had some of these problematic gamete regulation provisions. Some of them, they literally told us they had seen the Our Father documentary and they were concerned about that, or they've been talking to some of these donor conceived person advocates. And I think that they certainly didn't intend to do anything that would be harmful to the LGBTQ community, but didn't realize what some of these unintended consequences are. We so far have been able to stave those off in this Congress. They haven't been reintroduced, in part because we've been able to educate the staff, but we'll certainly be watching for those. Before I pass the baton, just so that folks don't think that everything that happens in Washington is bad, there are also some proactive things happening in Congress, like the Equal Access to Reproductive Care Act, introduced, not yet introduced, but should be soon by Representative Schiff, that would fix IRS regulations to expand the ability to deduct medical expenses associated with assisted reproduction from taxes. There's also something in the works called the Right to Build Families Act that would create an actual right to assisted reproduction, which could be very important if it could get passed, and potentially trumping some of these state bills that may have a threatening effect in the law against assisted reproduction. We're also working with Hill offices to advocate with the Office of Personnel Management for better coverage for infertility in the federal employees health system, which is really important because that can really be a market mover. And we're doing some advocacy with the FDA to lift some of their outdated restrictions around men who have sex with men being sperm donors, because this is something that's sometimes very important for members of our community. So there are things happening at the federal level. I just wanted folks to be aware of that, but now we're going to shift back to the states, because I think, as Polly said, what we really want folks to take away from this is that if you see things that don't even necessarily look like they're threatening on their face, flag it for us and let's talk about it and see how we can make sure that nothing scoots through that we don't want to see pass. So thanks so much. I will pass it, I think, to Meg now.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. So I am here to talk about some opportunities to extend protections for LGBTQ plus families. So you've heard all of the threats and all of those types of things that are coming up, but we really also want to look at how do we protect the families that exist now, or the families that are hoping to exist. There are over 18 million LGBTQ adults in the US, and nearly 1 in 3 are raising kids under 18 years old. Stable and secure parent-child relationships, or really relationships with their care providers, which are often their parents, are really key to children's well-being and are a source of all rights and responsibilities. Now, when I talk about parentage, what I'm talking about is a legally recognized and secure relationship between a child and their parent or parents. As we all know, people form families in a variety of ways, including through assisted reproduction, adoption, surrogacy, and blending, and this is especially true of LGBTQ families. However, many state laws have not really kept up with the ways that people make families, and this current patchwork of parentage laws leaves kids vulnerable. Every state should have clear, accessible ways to establish legal ties between children and their parents, and updating parentage laws are really key to this protection. Why is it important? Well, it's really important for kids. Parentage protections are emotionally, socially, and developmentally important. They allow for secure attachment, which we know is critical to development. And abrupt separation between parents and their kids is really damaging. Parentage protections provide access to legal protections and rights, such as medical, educational, and legal decision-making, hospital visitation, comfort and support. They ensure that those relationships between children and their parents can endure, even if a parent passes away or if the relationship breaks down. And there's also economic benefits attached to parentage as well. So potentially state financial assistance or child support or inheritance rights. The Uniform Law Commission created the Uniform Parentage Act in the 70s, and it's since been updated several times. The most recent update was in 2017. That was updated to be gender neutral and to create really the most comprehensive model to ensure that all children can have an equitable path to parentage. And it reflects how families, all families, including LGBTQ families, are formed today, considering things like assisted reproduction. 7 states have adopted the 2017 UPA. As you heard Polly say, some of the states have included Article 9 that specifically addresses donor conception, but some have not. But still, we've got 7 states that have adopted the updated Uniform Parentage Act, and that provides a few different avenues for establishing parentage, including giving birth, provided you're not a surrogate, presumptions that include both marital and non-marital presumptions, voluntary acknowledgements of parentage, adjudication of parentage, so a court order saying that someone's a parent, adoption, assisted reproduction, surrogacy. All of these protections are really important. And they're important even though parentage may arise as a matter of state law under many of these doctrines. Why is updated parentage law still important, even though there may be some of these presumptions? Well, because of things like discrimination, additional security for families when they go across state lines, full faith and credit, again, under the Constitution, so orders that are recognized across state lines. The current laws without some of these protections or without some of the parentage updates really leave people vulnerable because the protections that the states are currently offering are limited. So we've got the marital presumption. All states have that. And even the Supreme Court says that that must be applied equally to same-sex couples. But, these presumptions can be rebuttable for some period of time. And so it leaves families still at risk. And obviously the marital presumption doesn't protect kids whose parents are not married, which is a significant number of families. We do have things like the voluntary acknowledgements of parentage that were designed to create parentage for children whose parents aren't married. They're fast, affordable, and easy. But while they've been around for a long time for different sex couples, only 11 states offer them for same-sex couples. So again, we really want to update some of these parentage protections to have more states provide this option. We have adoption, confirmatory adoption, step-parent adoption, co-parent and second-parent adoption, but only step-parent adoption, so for married couples, is available in every state. And again, it's only for married couples. We have some states that offer confirmatory adoption, confirming legal parentage, often for children who are born from assisted reproduction. That's only available in a limited number of states, but we're hoping to expand the number of states that offer that option as well, and expand the number of states that offer options for people who aren't married to engage in the adoption process as well. These updates are important for trans and non-binary families as well, who are often subject to misgendering on their children's legal documents, including their birth certificates. This is harmful. It creates barriers and safety concerns, quite frankly, for these parents. The 2017 update, again, to the Uniform Parentage Act, like we talked about, removes some of that gendered language. And it's a really important change. But the bottom line of all of this is that we really need clear, equitable legal protections for all children and families, regardless of biology or marital status of the parents. And these are the efforts that we're trying to do to improve those protections for these kids and for these families. We just published a parentage report, all of these groups in collaboration with one another, and the Movement Advancement Project that's not here with us on this call. And that, I believe, was put in the chat. If not, it will be soon, so you can check that out for more information. But now I want to turn it back over to Polly, who's going to talk about the implementation of these parentage protections in the various states.
Thank you, Meg. All right. So one of the reasons why we're so happy to be talking to you is because states are acting in this space to create security and equality for LGBTQ families. And we think it is so important. The work is so important, and we want to support you in that work. And, some question that folks often ask is, why can't we just pass a federal law like a magic wand and make everything better? We can't in the area of family law, right? Each state has its own family laws. So, while it's helpful to have nationwide marriage equality, which opens up adoption to everybody in the state if they're married, state like fundamental parentage law is a state by state thing. So, and we really want state parentage laws to protect all children, no matter how they come into our families, because for unmarried people, it's so important, non-biological people, single parents, it is just really important that each state is protecting every child within its borders. And that's why, we're really committed to that work, and we want to partner with you in that work as well. Meg already talked about some of the states that have updated their laws through the Uniform Parentage Act. I will say the map report is awesome because it will show you where your state lies. I will say many, many states have not done this work. You can't adopt your child if you're not married. There are not protections for children born through assisted reproduction or surrogacy. We have families and children who are really not protected. And, I'm sure you probably hear from very nervous families in your state. We hear from a lot of families, from a lot of lawyers who are really, want to protect their kids and their clients and are not able to do so. So we really think that parentage reform legislation, which really changes the system, is really opting for a system that's equal and that reduces barriers to protecting your kid, financial barriers and whatnot, that this is really incredibly important work. I think that I want to just specifically say, I know it's really hard to do proactive work in a lot of states right now. I totally get that. And sometimes parentage work is really an issue that brings people together. It's really, particularly a lot of the work that we all do is often really behind the scenes, and they don't even know that LGBTQ organizations are working on the issue. And that's the kind of work we're prepared to do to make sure that children are at the center, that it's an issue about protecting all children, no matter how they come into our families, and not just about LGBTQ families, because frankly, it isn't, right? There are so many kids who are left out of these systems, and we need to protect them. And every state does a little bit differently. That is the beauty of states, right? I worked in New Hampshire, which is a red state, to expand adoption access to unmarried people, because there was a terrible case about a non-LGBTQ family that couldn't adopt a child together, right? And we used that opportunity to pass protections so unmarried people could adopt each other. Colorado took a phenomenal approach to parentage legislation and updating their code, but in a really kind of narrow way. They kind of use the fewest possible words to create the most possible protections. And then, for example, Connecticut, 150-page bill that literally changed every part of their code to be for equality is another way to do it, which is just to say there's a lot of ways to move the ball forward, and incremental ways, big ways. And I think there's a lot of energy on this issue. We are currently, various ones of us and also collaborative, are working on legislation in Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Hawaii, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, Oregon. I'm sure I'm missing some. New Hampshire, we're working on voluntary acknowledgements in New Hampshire. There are a number of states where work is ongoing, again, sometimes very behind the scenes, sometimes not, to try to move forward to protect our families. So if your state is working on parentage reform or adoption reform, we'd love to help and connect. If you're in one of those states and you want to learn more, we'd love to share with you and have you part of those coalitions and that work. Please be in touch. Thanks so much.
Okay, and I think I'm up, and I'd like to talk a little bit about education, prevention, advocacy, and communication. First, with regard to education, local practitioners can make such a huge difference just by educating their neighbors about the law in your jurisdiction and the importance of legally securing intimate and parent-child relationships. And you may want to consider local practitioners and jurists, whether that is putting on a training for local judicial personnel. I know that local bar associations are frequently looking for speakers or writers for their publications or monthly webinars. Law schools are also a great place for outreach. Do the family law classes at your local law school cover LGBTQ plus issues? Are the legal clinics at your local law schools offering help to people in these situations? Reach out. You may have the opportunity to guest lecture, or even just provide materials that can be added to the syllabus, can make a huge difference towards educating the next generation of family law attorneys. In terms of general community outreach, it's huge just for people to know that there are LGBTQ friendly and competent attorneys available in their area, letting them know of the resources available. And I think probably everyone will nod vigorously when I say the most important thing that we often stress when speaking to lay people is that having your name on a child's birth certificate does not establish legal parentage. I might just tattoo this on my forehead, I guess probably backwards so you can read it on Zoom. I think everyone on this call has spoken with non-genetic parents who were listed on a child's birth certificate. Their relationships ended and those people were ultimately devastated when a court ruled that they were a legal stranger with no right to a child that they've raised since birth. So that's a hugely important message to get out there, particularly for people who have fewer financial means. We're seeing a big rise in DIY sort of family building, and that often involves finding either somebody who you already know or somebody who's available on the internet as a donor. And unfortunately, many people using these methods are misinformed regarding the relevant law. They may erroneously believe that their family is safe. They may draw up a contract that is unfortunately completely unenforceable. They may be unaware that, for example, their state requires a medical professional to be involved in insemination. So, while we absolutely understand that, not everybody has the financial means to do things other ways, it's just very, very important for them to know the relevant law and, to make sure that they're doing whatever they can to protect their family. In terms of prevention, legal wellness checkups are a way to identify and address issues before they arise. If you have an LGBTQ plus person coming through the doors of your organization, it could be an attorney, a social work, or a paralegal can conduct a checkup to try and identify issues. There are a few different legal wellness example tools available. One right here from where I am in Pennsylvania's Neighborhood Legal Services has a legal wellness tool online, which you can check out just as an example of the kinds of questions to ask to try and identify these issues. It can be really difficult to speak to clients and to community members about the importance of securing relationships and end-of-life planning. And that's especially because, people don't like to think, especially in these times, we've got so many negative things to think about. Healthy people in happy relationships don't expect to end up in family court. And so in those situations, it can be very helpful to point out that, parentage can become an issue even in intact relationships in the context of travel, the illness or death of a parent, public benefits or child welfare. Issues of parentage usually come up in the context of a family stressor or an emergency. These are not the times when people need an additional worry or obstacle. Even of course, healthy young people can experience sudden illness or injury, and not in terms of just parent-child relationships, but also intimate partner relationships. It's particularly important when an adult's relationship with their family of origin is strained to make sure that their partner is able to make decisions about their medical care. Family law is also embedded in a lot of systems and institutions that people experiencing poverty encounter. So again, even if you are in an intact same-sex relationship, we have We have all spoken to people who have found themselves with a child support or child welfare office demanding information about a child's other genetic parent, or even seeking to establish a non-genetic parent's parentage in favor of adult. Peer voices can be really helpful in preventive client counseling. Attorneys may be viewed either as overcautious or financially self-interested. Hearing firsthand accounts by community members who regret not taking action to protect themselves is a really powerful tool. And unfortunately, there are a lot of those stories out there. In terms of advocacy, there are so many ways to get involved that aren't, a huge time ask. Op-eds, really great legislative testimony. School board meetings are certainly the site of a lot of action these days. You can sign up to train as a legal observer with the National Lawyers Guild. I'd like to draw your all attention to the Protecting Pride Organizing Guide, a great resource out of Western State Center. And as Polly mentioned, if you're in a state that lacks comprehensive parentage protections, and particularly if you're in a state with a pending UPA bill and you're interested in getting involved, please get in touch with us. And on that note, as national organizations, we do our absolute best to stay on top of any and all litigation and legislation about or affecting our community, but it's a lot. It's a lot, especially right now. So please, don't assume that we're aware. Get in touch if you hear of, legislation or cases affecting LGBTQ families. Please get in touch with us. Encourage your colleagues to get in touch with us. Both NCLR and GLAAD provide legal information and technical assistance. So please send people our way. And finally, I encourage you to sign up for our newsletters for updates, wonderful webinars like this, and other resources. You already have our parentage report in the chat. There's a lot of other information available on all of our websites. And if you need something that you can't find, please ask.
All right, thank you all. Thank you, Nesta. So this was a ton of information, obviously presented pretty quickly. We are going to share out these resources. I just posted a bunch of them in the chat. And we're going to take a little bit of time now to answer some questions. So if you have a question you haven't yet posted in the Q&A box, please go ahead and do so. I just want to start with a question just to sort of say that all of these things that we talked about today are related, right? And just to be clear that what Nesta is talking about is the fact that when we have states where the laws have not been updated, it's really important to make sure that people, families, parents really understand what the state of the law is in that state and what steps are available to protect their relationship and their families. And so we have some guides for that. And then the next step is advocating to update the law where it hasn't been updated so that it is more accessible for anyone, any family of any means, to make sure that their children are protected and their families are protected. And then, thinking about the risks that we started this conversation with, and where there are attempts to create these kind of overbroad restrictions and laws that really can have unintended consequences, that if they happen in states where there are not clear legal protections for families, for LGBTQ families and other families grown through assisted reproduction, that can lead to some serious consequences for those children and those families. And we've all seen the horrifying court cases. There've been a couple of high profile cases over the last year or two where judges have essentially taken children away, or taken a parent away from a child that child has known their whole life. And that's really what we want to avoid here. So I am going to just say quickly, as the comms person on the call, that if you are thinking about any of this, if any of this is happening in your state, and you want to talk about messaging, you want to talk about how we talk about this, I am happy to be in touch. So please feel free to reach out to me about that. The one thing I will say, just top line, is that it is important to keep the focus on these being about child-centered laws, and whether it's the proactive trying to update the laws positively, or the risks. Either way, it is ultimately children who are going to bear the brunt of these issues. And so that is an important thing to keep in mind. All right, so enough for me. I'm going to read a couple of questions that we have gotten in the chat. So first of all, we have a question that says, this is a little bit of a test. Can you share a list of the 12 states that have the fertility fraud laws on the books and those you are monitoring?
Well, I can share with you the ones that we're monitoring, which is Michigan, New York, Washington, and I think Illinois. And if you give me a second, I'll put the other list in the chat. So hold that thought.
Okay, thank you, Polly. And then there was another question, which Julie, I know you answered this in the chat box, but for everybody else, the number of that federal bill that you were talking about, can you just share that once again?
Sure, I added the link to the congress.gov link in case somebody wants to actually read it. It's HR 451. The main sponsor is Congresswoman Bice. It has, I think, 19 Dems and 23 Rs or something like that. It's not exactly half and half, but it is pretty bipartisan.
All right, thank you. Polly, are you ready yet, or should we go on to the next question?
Oh, I'm slower than that, people.
Okay.
Nevada was the most recent in June. It's interesting, Nevada passed fertility fraud and actually passed comprehensive parentage reform, but the governor vetoed comprehensive parentage reform, which was very sad. But no, still working on that. Yeah.
And then there's a question, I'm curious about why you think the bills, particularly the bills that would create restrictions, are mostly being introduced in blue states and have any been introduced in red states?
Well, the fertility fraud bills, I would say, have mostly been in red states at this point. And once I have that list for you, you will see that. And for the gamete regulation bills, they have been, so one was passed in Colorado, one was passed in California, but vetoed by the governor, and there was one filed in Maryland. That's a really good question why it's in these states. I think that there is a perception that that these bills have really positive impacts, right? I think it's one of those areas of legislating that they're nuanced. It takes a lot of thought and understanding and walking people through to understand why they have very unintended consequences. So I think people think, oh, we're really, being helpful here. And I think that that's one of the reasons, but folks might be able to add to that.
So I'll pick up on that a little bit, Polly. And I think in some ways, this question goes right to the heart of why we wanted to have this briefing to begin with, because if advocates for donor conceived people who have, again, as Jordan said, very legitimate concerns that they would like to see addressed, approach sympathetic lawmakers who then introduce legislation, it's not always obvious on its face what some of the harmful consequences are. And I honestly believe that some of those DCP advocates themselves didn't realize when they kind of started down this path. And some of them have engaged with us in good faith to understand it better and work towards something that maybe we can all agree on. But like any movement, there's a range, and some of them are a little bit more aligned with some interests that we definitely are not. But then some we can work with. So I think it's one of these interesting areas. Like usually the issues we work on, whether it's in reproductive rights or LGBTQ equality, like we know it's sort of us and them. Like we're pro-equality and those are the people who are for discrimination, or we're pro-choice and those people are anti-abortion. Here it's more nuanced, as you said, Polly. It's not so much an us versus them. There are issues that are present for some donor conceived people, but not all. And it's legitimate for them to seek to address those. And again, to the point of how important collage in all of this is, sometimes they have a tendency to represent as though they do speak for all donor conceived people, and they don't. Because for very obvious reasons, kids in queer families know from a pretty early age that if there was donor conception involved. So it's more nuanced, and it may just be that they have found receptive legislators in some of these blue states. I think it does, not because they're not trying in some of the other states, but they have found, a sympathetic ear there, and that's where they've gone.
Also, just practically speaking, at least the bills that we've interfaced on, there's always been a person or group of people living in that state that are really the citizen faces of these bills. And I think it's lucky that we have been largely faced with blue state legislation on this, in part because the potential for harm is so high should this be latched onto by folks that are looking to harm LGBTQ families. I think we're lucky that the folks that we've been dealing with, their goal really doesn't seem to be attacking us, but in the event that in states that are much less friendly, that there's a coalition to get a bill like this passed, I think that we would have some bigger concerns, because I'm sure they would really take the opportunity to exploit the patchwork that Meg was talking about in terms of protections for our families. So I'm grateful that the folks so far seem to be coming from blue states that are looking for this, because I think it has made our job a little bit easier, but it also really highlights why we have some long-term concerns to address.
And I'm happy to now share the states, some of which were enacted like there was California passed many decades ago, and is more narrow, but Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Louisiana, Ohio, Texas, Utah, and again, Nevada this past June.
And those again, Polly, are the states specifically with fertility fraud?
Fertility fraud, yeah.
All right, so last call, if anybody has any further questions, go ahead and post them in the chat. If not, I want to open it up to the panelists to see if you have any last thoughts before we wrap up. And then just a reminder to everyone that we will be sending out a link to the recording with some of the more detailed information that was shared today in an email.
Well, I just want to hop in to say one thing that I don't think any of us shared, which is one of the concerns about some of this regulation, the fertility fraud and gamete regulation bills, is it really exceptionalizes our families for special treatment in a way that, we think reinforces bias, reinforces the notion that only genetic families are valid families. And, we just think that obviously our vision of the world is one, first of all, where parents disclose in a developmentally appropriate way the origins of their birth to their children as soon as possible. And that, children first and foremost really need a secure relationship with the people that they know as their parents.
I also just couldn't pass up an opportunity to encourage all of you who are on the call to really be thinking about and paying attention to the ways in which legislation, cultural conversations, etc., are impacting not just LGBTQ families, but children in LGBTQ families. I think we have a tendency when we're talking about don't say gay bills or anti-LGBTQ or anti-trans specifically legislation to be focused on youth who identify that way. And are not necessarily thinking about the ways in which even straight children who have queer parents are being just as negatively impacted by these pieces of legislation and these cultural conversations that are happening. And Collage would love to be more engaged on these issues around the country. And just wanted to stand on the soapbox for a second and remind everyone to remember us, because we exist, and the baby boom is as old as the millennials, and so we're not that young anymore. And really, we have a voice that I think is missing from a lot of these conversations. So whether it be within gamete provision or generally speaking, contact Collage. We would love to work with you on various things.
And isn't Collage gathering families in Atlanta this weekend?
Yes, thank you, Polly. We're having our inaugural Atlanta Family Weekend. You can look for more information on our website, collage.org. But if you're in Georgia or know people in Georgia who would like to be surrounded by other queer families, and especially queer families of color, we would love to see you this weekend.
And I hate to step on Julie's federal toes here, but please support the Marriage Equality for Persons with Disabilities Act, intersectional justice. We love it.
Since everybody else has added something, I'm going to add something as well. But I just wanted to reiterate that please reach out to us if you hear anything that's happening in your states on any of these matters that we've talked about today. That these are laws or potential laws that really impact families, that really impact kids. Even when we talk about laws or updates like parentage, right? It sounds like you're coming from this protect the parents, and it does protect the parents, but what it really does also is it protects those kids. It keeps those relationships that those kids have secure, and it attaches those kids legally to the people they are already attached to. And so that's essential. And when we talk about these bills or things that could really undermine LGBTQ families, it is those the potential consequences of those bills are exacerbated in places that do not have good parentage protections. And as we've seen, that is a lot of states. So we have some work to do. We are doing that work. We have some exciting forward movement coming in this next session, but please do reach out to us and so that we can all collaborate and move the needle forward for protecting LGBTQ families.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to everyone for joining. And again, just to reiterate, reach out to any of us with any follow-up questions you have about all of this, and we'll be sharing some information out with you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.